Recently, I've been using a selection of new types of clay in combination with the high iron stoneware body I normally use. And some of those, especially the particularly coarse ones, have given me beautiful results, especially when shown in combination with all my other pots, as these more unusual pieces stand out. And so in this video, I'll be throwing two of those unusual pots, made with various clays blended together and sprinkled with additional iron spangles that should melt and move during the reduction firing, creating small blots of molten iron in amongst the feldspathic crackle glaze on the pots. I'll be mixing both of these clays down with 2/3 of my normal stoneware, which means that each vase will be made up of 1 pound of the different clay and 2 pounds of this smoother body, for a total of 3 pounds or 1,360 grams. This pink grog, as it's called, fired wonderfully last time, but it did come with some issues, such as being quite painful to throw with, but it also cracked occasionally as it cooled. It should darken my usual body and add some contrast in texture and colour. And for the other lump of clay, I'll be blending my normal body with this lighter, coarse stoneware, which is called David Wright's hand building body. Again, this stuff is really coarse, but I don't think it has enough colour to overpower the stoneware I'm already using, as it fires to a very light, toasted brown, but who knows, these are 2 tests after all. To mix these bodies quickly, I first pat each into a similar shape, and then I slice them into thin layers and stack them up. I then give each lump a quick spiral wedge just to roughly bring the bodies together, and then I drop a big pinch of iron spangles into the folds of each. These are created by hammering hot iron and are so fine they feel like sand. I sprinkle it over the mass of clay, and then I thoroughly spiral wedge these lumps up until completely blended and smooth. And this should give me a fired result that looks something like this, provided of course that it's fired in a reduction atmosphere. If fired in oxidation, such as in an electric kiln, you'll still end up with speckles in your pots. But as iron is refractory in oxidation, your results will probably be very different compared to those I get. I'll then wedge these up, slicing them through occasionally to make sure the 3 components are blended properly, which, as you can see, they aren't quite yet. I'm not looking to create pots that are completely different compared to those I normally make. I want the shapes to reside within the same family, but with subtle changes of clothes. If you'd like to watch this spiral wedging process much slower and really explained in great detail, you can click on the link on screen now or find it in the description below. But essentially, all this does is blend the material and remove any pockets of air found within the lumps of clay. It's been extraordinarily cold recently, so throwing with warm water is a must. Warm doesn't do it justice really. This is piping hot, but it cools down quickly as it's diluted with slip. I also keep this taller bucket to my left, and it's against the sharp edge of this that I scrape the slip off my hands against. And thankfully, the Florian of yesterday left his cleaned up throwing tools in a nice row ready to use. Here are the 2 bits of clay side by side, with the pink grogged mix on the left and the David Wright blend on the right. And all the extra grog the clay now contains has been distributed evenly, which you can see as the white specks in the body. These are made from pre-fired ceramic material that's ground up and added back to the clay. And it does things like making it stronger, making it less prone to warping, and it also means it shrinks less, which helps with things such as cracking as pots dry and shrink. But due to its minimal content in this mix, I should barely be able to feel it. To begin with, the lump of clay is slammed down firmly against the wheelhead, as centrally as I can get it. It's then covered in water, and I squeeze the lump of clay right where it meets the metal to make sure the stoneware is sealed in place. It's then coned up and down, a process that blends the clay further, aligning the particles, making for a more homogeneous mass of clay. Throughout this, my arms are tucked tightly into my torso, and I also brace my forearms on the plastic tray of the wheel. My hands then apply equal pressure from the side and the top, whilst using lots of water so the clay can spin freely beneath them, and I gradually maneuver the piece of clay until it's spinning smoothly, without any slight undulations in the sides or the top. I then find centre and press down, opening up the lump of clay to form the internal base of the vase. I often get comments asking how I keep my hands so clean as I centre and throw pots, but bear in mind, every time the camera angle changes, I've had to get up, clean my hands, dry them, move the camera, and then come back to the wheel, which means my hands are much cleaner than they normally are when I throw pots without filming. With the thicker ring of clay collared up into a more manageable shape, I can now begin pulling the walls up properly. For which, recently, I've been using a mud tool sponge on the outside to do, especially with bodies that contain a bit more tooth that feel as if they absorb water more quickly. It makes a real difference, especially for the first 2 to 3 pulls. I find it helps the most for that initial moment when you're pressing in the clay towards the base, so that it's in a portion of the wall that you can then lift up. Before each pull, I soak the sponge in water, scoop up clay from around the bottom and push it into the wall, and then very gradually, in one even motion, I lift this mound of clay up. On the inside, my fingers are pushing out just above where the sponge is, where the bulge is, in fact, and the thicker walls are essentially squeezed through a smaller gap between my fingers on the inside and outside, extruding it almost. To keep the cylinder nice and straight, after each pull I collar the shape in and spend a moment just compressing the rim. As the cylinder spins around, it will naturally want to splay outward, so by collaring it in after each pull, it just helps keep the shape more manageable, especially for the first few pulls. And now that the cylinder has gained some height, I'll begin pulling the walls up and shaping at the same time, although I take it slowly, widening the form bit by bit with each pull, as trying to form the pot shape in one sweeping pull is just asking for things to go wrong, especially with shapes that end up being a bit more angular, like mine. Where these sharp points are, it's so easy for just one tiny mistake to create an irreversible error, be it an undulation or a tear, or if the supporting wall underneath is made too thinly, then the thicker, heavier material above it can cause the thin patches to buckle and twist and potentially collapse, if not dealt with quickly enough. I've now thrown the lower section thin enough to my liking, so I'll go ahead and scrape the slip off this to refine the shape and to strengthen it somewhat before the next step, which will be forming the more intricate top, which slopes in then out quite sharply. And I've now switched to using my fingertip on the outside, as I can feel more of what's going on beneath my fingertips, as compared to when there's a sponge in between the two. As the wall begins to slope inward, I'm throwing with fingertips beneath it to support it from potentially slumping inward. With this particular shape, proportion is everything. The lower tapering section of the pot has to make up at least half the height of the vessel, as otherwise the shape begins to feel quite short and stout as it loses its balance. Equally, with this angled upper section, if the walls don't pinch in enough, it appears to me like why even bother angling the top section at all. Yet, at the same time, if they pinch in too much, the angularity becomes too drastic, overwhelming the vase. Now, I'm sure much of my thoughts on this are relatively subjective, but after making probably 1,000 pots with a similar shape, when they're wrong, it really stands out. I use a heat gun just to blast this angle, as I don't want the waste to belly out anymore, which it may very well do as I continue working on the upper section. This is something I do quite a lot with the more angular shapes, as it only takes 30 seconds or less to dry an outer portion of the pot, which results in the rest of the throwing being a bit more straightforward, as the vase holds its shape more easily. If you watched my recent video where I threw this coarse, pink, grogged stoneware raw, you'll have heard me complain about how it ground against the skin of my hands, like throwing with sandpaper. But in this instance, I can barely feel it, nor can I feel the iron oxide spangles. It's when I come to trim this pot that the coarse particles will become a lot more present, as they'll grind against the metal blades and scratch the surface of the pot, leaving lots of unwanted lines. Speaking of lines, I gently remove the worst of the throwing rings left on the top section of the vase that flares out, and then I remove all the slip and water left in the bottom of the vase, and finally chamois leather the rim smooth. A twisted metal wire is then slid beneath the pot. I prefer the twisted sort as they create a larger cut that's less likely to stick back together, and then with dry hands I cup the vessel and lift away, spinning the wheel at the exact moment I lift up to break any seal. The next piece of clay is more or less the same, although I'll be throwing a slightly different shape with straighter walls at the top. So it's both very similar to the previous shape, whilst also contrasting it slightly. The clay is centred, coned up and pressed down, a process that's easier to do when you make sure the top of the lump of clay is round before you begin pressing it up. This way a divot doesn't form on the top of the cone as the clay is compressed up. If you do create this hole, it's easy to trap air and water in the lump, both of which will only make the next steps more difficult. Once coned, my aim is to create a shape that has roughly flat sides and a flat top. It definitely doesn't have to be perfect, as long as it's not spinning uncontrollably at this point. If I were to leave my hands and just let them simply rest on the piece of clay, the clay's movement underneath them shouldn't have any influence on them, meaning my hands should sit perfectly still as the clay moves. That's when you know your clay is centered. The lump of clay is then opened up with about 3 or 4 millimeters left in the base. You neither want it too thin or too thick, as both come with their own problems, although I suppose it's best to leave it thicker, as the excess material can always be turned away. Yet, if you accidentally throw a pot with a base that's too thin and you tear a hole in it as you glide the wire underneath, it can be quite difficult to plug and fix. Although in the rare cases it does happen, this is how I fix it. So, here's our hole, and the first thing I do is scrape away all the slip that covers the base. I then take a ball of soft clay and press it into a round disc. I then place it into the base of the pot and firmly press it down, spreading it from the centre to the outside walls. Once it's more or less there, I'll begin to throw it and compress it with my thumb like this. You can equally use a wet sponge or a plastic kidney to do the same job. And lastly, I neaten everything up by pressing the flat side of a rib down against the base. And then the pot can continue to be thrown like normal. Excuse the low light here. It's been really stormy in the UK over the past few days, and it's either constantly raining or windy, and I'm sure you'll be hearing both throughout this video. I can't wait for sunnier, better weather, as I feel like I've been throwing in the dark with my spotlight for months now. The way I tend to throw most of these vase forms with a narrow base is to first throw a tall cylinder. Once it's high enough and I feel like the clay is evenly distributed throughout it, I'll then begin to belly the shape out from the inside, stretching the walls into a more curvaceous shape. I then segment off those curves into straight planes, thus creating the more angular shape. If instead you were to try and throw pots with very angular shapes straight away, you'll have a much more difficult time, as you'll very quickly encounter sharp changes of angle in the wall that lessen the overall strength of the pot. So they begin as being curved, like this, and then I segment them off, as I no longer have to move any of the additional clay from below into the upper section of the wall. Whereas if I were to try and do that now, take more clay from the base and pull it past that sharp line in the waist, I'd have a really hard time ensuring the pot kept its shape. In fact, I'd be better off simply collaring the whole pot back into a tight cylinder to reset so I can start the shaping again. In this instance, the rim was a bit too thick for my liking. I want them to come to a sharp, beveled edge, yet at the same time they need to be substantial enough so the pots hold their shape as they're lifted away from the wheel. So whilst the very lip is nice and sharp, the walls of clay beneath it are a bit thicker. This way you perceive the pot visually as potentially being lighter and more delicate than it really is. I then scrape away the skirt of clay from around the bottom, being careful to not let the scrap of clay that's removed push back into the wall, as it's very easy to distort the bottom at this stage. I then clean over this section with a brass rib, straightening it out fully, and sponge out the excess water and slip. I even sometimes use the sponge like a kidney on the inside to smooth the internal walls and to make sure the interior shape is correct. A soft chamois leather is then draped and held over the rim to compress it, and then I slide a taut, twisted metal wire underneath it. I clasp the pot lightly, and as I lift, I keep my hands on either side level, and I'm not squeezing them inward. Instead, they're simply cupped around the sticky clay, and that's enough to keep it securely in your hands. And for now, that's these 2 pots finished. I'll sling some plastic loosely over them overnight. This way they don't potentially dry out too much, or lean over to one side as a draft hits them and causes them to dry unevenly. If I'm leaving pots out over the weekend, I'll even just place a bucket over them, which means I'm fussing around less with plastic sheeting, and they'll dry very slowly and very evenly. The fact these are thrown with coarse clay means they should hold their shape better. They'll also dry more quickly, or at least that's my experience with coarse clays so far. They tend to stiffen up a bit more rapidly, which in this damp and cold weather certainly isn't something I'm going to complain about. It's the following morning, and the 2 pots are now completely leather hard from top to bottom. They feel cool and dry, and aren't sticky whatsoever. This piece did move a little bit overnight, which you can see in the now wavering rim. To fix this, I take the vase and flip it upside down, tap center it, and then I trim away the high point on the bottom that's spinning around, leveling it flat. I then place the vase the right way up, and now when spun, you can see that the rim no longer rises and falls like it did. Anyway, to attach this vase onto the wheel, I first brush some slip onto the metal in a ring that's roughly the same diameter as the base. The pot is then placed onto that and tap centered, and the friction created, as well as the slip quickly drying, really holds the pot firmly in place. You'll hear the difference in the clay at this point as the coarse grog grinds against the metal blade. It's for this reason too that I don't use my normal tungsten carbide turning tools when working with grogged clay like this, as the larger particles could very easily chip the brittle blades. Instead, I use cheaper, stronger steel tools. These don't hold much of an edge, which is why I trim only using one corner of the blade, as I can apply much more pressure in a single point like this, removing more material in a more controlled manner. And whilst sharp tools do help the turning process, I think technique is more important, as I can use inexpensive tools to achieve practically the same result I'd get from when turning a pot with my tungsten carbide tools. Yes, sharper blades do help speed the process up and require you to use less pressure, yet with enough experience you can trim a pot no matter the tool set you have. And it's a bad idea to think that acquiring better, sharper, more expensive tools is radically going to change how you trim. And they might help, but they're also more difficult to use in many ways. And in fact, what's going to make the biggest difference is the same old boring answer: practice. With the rim and upper walls turned, the vase is flipped over and I can begin turning the base. A task that's aided by the spinner on top, which I can push down through to help keep the pot pinned onto the wheel. Without it, the 3 lumps of clay around the rim might not be enough to secure the pot down properly. And even when it comes to turning the base, like so, despite there being no spinner, I'm still applying that downward pressure through the tool and through my fingertips, as otherwise the force of trimming would easily be enough to lift and pull the pot off centre. Next, I'll begin trimming out a shallow footwell to remove just a tad more weight from the vase to make the vessel lighter. I then burnish the clay on the foot to smooth it and stamp it with my maker's mark. The vase is then placed on this very smooth bat. This way there's no texture from the surface it's placed on that can transfer into the still relatively soft clay. And the last thing I do is just double check the rim to make sure it's perfectly smooth, unscratched, and free of any burrs of clay that may have stuck into it from when the vase was upturned. Next, it's the vase made with the David Wright hand building body, or at least 1/3 of it mixed with 2/3 of my usual high iron stoneware body. Once again I turn the base flat, which helps level out the top. I then slip and attach the vase to the wheel, which means I can trim the entirety of the walls from top to bottom without any lumps of clay or mechanical arms getting in the way, like you might find on a Giffen grip. I press a portion of the wall into the wheel head to seal it, and as the pot spins you can see there's a slight irregularity in the rim, which I fix by gently pushing a tapering form into the opening of the vase, holding it there for a few seconds so the roundness of the bowl forces the opening of the vase to have the same shape. And then, just like with the other vase, I refine and lighten the shape by trimming away at the walls only using a small portion of the blade. Throughout this process, I'm keeping my hands steady by bracing my wrists against each other and by tucking my elbows into my torso. I even lean my upper body weight onto my right arm to aid in keeping it stable when my left hand is inside the vessel, like so, feeling the cross section so I know just how much to remove. Occasionally, the blade will catch on the clay, pulling it off centre. It's for this reason, when you're trimming, to always have your left hand somewhere on the pot, instead of using two hands, for instance on the turning tool, which I sometimes see. This way your left hand is ready to catch the pot if it comes loose. That disruption caused me to knock the rim with my hand, so once again I just fixed the irregularity by pressing the bowl into the opening. The walls were then scraped over to remove the worst of the marks left by the turning tool, as textured clays seem to aid in tools leaving a more chattered surface. These are very fine lines in the pot caused as the blade bounces and moves on the surface as the pot spins, so it's those I'm scraping away. The vase is then turned over, tap centered, secured in place with 3 lugs of clay, and then the bottom of the pot can be finished. I beveled this bottom edge, which helps the pot stand out when placed on a flat surface, as it'll cast a shadow beneath itself, making it seem as if it's floating. It also creates a point of contact that's less severe and less likely to chip. The shallow well is hollowed out, the tool gripped very firmly, as it's ever so easy to make a mistake at this point, such as gouging away at the foot that encircles the well or simply trimming a hole all the way through it. The stoneware is then burnished with the smooth, flat side of a plastic kidney. This compresses the grog into the body, but only for the moment. When this pot is fired and the clay shrinks, it'll do so around more coarse particles. But by getting ahead of it here, I should end up with a surface that isn't quite so rough. And that's the two finished for now. I'll cover them with plastic and let them slowly dry, and I won't move them off these very smooth bats until that's happened, as the last thing I want is to accidentally indent the bases I so carefully finished. They're a sweet pair, and I can't wait to fire them, as whilst I don't think the differences will be huge, they'll certainly have a bit more life in them compared to my usual pots, and hopefully I'll get around to glazing and firing these really soon. Thank you so much for taking your precious time to watch. It really means a lot. As always, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next week.